guys, welcome back to the Scottish Gaming Rebels. I'm everybody's favourite host, SkinnyRebel. Before we get into today's video, I would like to do a special Twitch mention and also say that I'm no longer streaming on Reaper's Rebels. I'm now streaming on the Scottish Gaming Rebels Twitch with the Fatman. Make sure you go check us out on Twitch over at Scottish Gaming Rebels and I'll see you there. Now, today's review will be on Before We Leave, so without further ado, let's get straight in. It's been many years since a major disaster brought about the fall of civilization. The planet's inhabitants, or peeps, live in a vault underground. Now is the time to advance forward to an uncertain future. Now is the time to return to the surface. You can forget the Fallout-esque post-apocalyptic scenarios. You've become accustomed to it though. And Before We Leave, the latest game from publishers Team 17, the world has fully recovered from catastrophe nearly wiped out humanity in the first place. As a giant hand in the sky, you need to guide your peeps through this brave new world as they rebuild their once great society. At its core, Before We Leave is a city builder with a few 4X elements thrown in, starting off with a few huts and potato fields. You'll need to build, research and colonise your way to the stars and beyond. The most striking thing about the game is how relaxing it is. Unlike most games that fall within this genre, there aren't really any real adversaries. There aren't any nasty next door neighbours itching to take what you have. You won't need to wage war or hash out treaties. Evidently, your peeps are the only ones to make it out of the vault, and they are resolutely united as one. You make it to the stars, and you'll do it without having to fire a single bullet. Because there aren't any enemies to contend with, there's no mad dash for resources or strategic positioning. You're entirely free to mender along at your own pace. There's great pleasure in taking your time to plan out and build your civilization as you see fit, without the overarching threat of losing it all. It doesn't hurt that Before We Leave is so beautiful too. The world is vibrant and full of life, and each building is beautifully designed and distinguishable. Meanwhile, the day and night cycle brings you within beautiful moments of natural lighting. Daybreaks, when the society is washed in gold from the sun peeking over the horizon, are especially stunning. From a gameplay perspective, Before We Leave's HUD, or HUD as people like to call it, is both sleek and unobtrusive. Meanwhile, the mass information available to you is presented clearly, and problems with the individual buildings are easily identifiable by the large bubbles that appear above them. It's easy to get set up in Before We Leave. Place a house here, a library there, throw in a mine, and you're already on your way exploring the galaxy. There's a low barrier for entry here, and you won't be met with a wall of different systems to contend with right out of the gate. Don't mistake this for a lack of depth though. There are all the resource management that you could come to expect from any good strategy game, as well as the accompanying charts, as there aren't really any real adversaries. The real difficulty in Before We Leave stems from expanding your empire. As you colonise more islands and discover new planets, you'll encounter new environments which present unique challenges. As resources are often limited to one island, you'll need to establish shipping routes and specialised cities to ensure the entirety of your empire is well supplied and connected. You'll also need to start monitoring the happiness of your peeps too. Apart from their basic needs, you'll have to worry about providing clothing and luxuries, and taking into account the pollution that inevitably comes from expansion. You need to carefully plan cities so that peeps live in happiness, boosting areas of natural beauty, and are protected from negative effects of resource gathering. It's a nice element that adds a further layer of complexity to world building, but it ultimately doesn't go far enough. There aren't any real consequences for polluting your peeps or failing to provide adequate resources. The most you'll get are a few unhappy peeps who will move slower and harvest resources at a reduced rate, all at the end of the world, and I found you really have to try to get to that point anyway. Meanwhile, the game's only real enemy, the monstrous space whales who will devour your resources as they float past your planet, become a minor hindrance after you've advanced far enough down the tech tree. The fact is, it's hard to fail at all in Before We Leave. The game also ends up becoming repetitive the further you get into it. You fall into a familiar formula of colonising a new island, setting up the same few buildings and mining the same resources. I left feeling there was something missing to break up the monotony of the mid-game and beyond. Naturally, the combat system that would have usually filled this void wouldn't be suited here, considering the game's message. Still, should have been replaced with something, like perhaps an exploration of the disaster that drove humanity underground in the first place, or a greater story for players to discover. There are some little issues with it, but my experience with Before We Leave has been overwhelmingly positive. It's a game perfectly suited for a few hours of carefree entertainment, in both being easy on the eyes and easy to pick up too. You're afforded the luxury of building your empire and exploring the galaxy at your own pace, a refreshing departure from other 4X games where the threat of being nuked into oblivion often looms large. It's fair to say that Before We Leave is perhaps more suited to a beginner than a true veteran of the genre, but there's still more in a fair to remnants of the old world are littered across the hexagonal tiles of each planet. These are often strange pieces of leftover technology, ruined skyscrapers that reside up high mountains or submerged in the sea, or great mechanical behemoths that stand frozen in time as rusted monuments to a bygone age. The inclusion of such a rich and visual history, as well as its flawless execution, is easily one of Before We Leave's standout features, but it doesn't end there. The beauty of the game's mystery, however, is the mystery itself. Despite how integral and omnipresent the world's past is, the developers have deliberately kept everything pretty vague. That ambiguity allows the player to interpret the world in whatever way they want, which serves only to invest you in a further and new and thrilling experience. At its core, Before We Leave is a neat little city builder with a host boast of familiar gameplay features and mechanics such as resource management, a tech tree, and of course city building and planning. In the beginning, getting your little society going pretty easy. The society of peeps, yes I call peeps, is fairly basic and only require the essentials. These include potato farms, wells for water, huts to live in, and building materials like wood and stone. All very rudimentary, but it makes for a really calming and fun starting experience, especially with how easy to play and navigate its multiple menus and overlays. The casual nature of Before We Leave is definitely one of its main selling points, which it does still manage to preserve well in the slightly more challenging late game. Your first major goal will be to rebuild and commandeer a spaceship, colonise a new world. Along the way, you'll research new technology that will aid expansion and increase efficiency. This includes things like seafaring, electricity and cooking. These all provide new buildings, resources and better fulfill the needs of your little settlements. While this does make everything a little tougher to manage, the ability to automate things like trader routes and eventually jobs really takes a lot of the stress out of the late game experience. The game even hands a surprising level of depth when it comes to managing your settlements, providing you with bar charts, overlays and other intricate systems to help you optimise your playthrough. One of my personal favourites is the ability to a settlement resource reproduction as well as a supply demand. Information is incredibly helpful in understanding where the settlement is struggling and how you can fix it. This may sound a little daunting to those looking to relax and easy experience. Trust me when I say you have nothing to fear. Things like trade, automation and management provide more experienced players with new ways to optimise their playthrough, but the option is still there for casual players to have a good time and still be able to use these to their advantage. It perfectly balances casual and fun and strategic complexity, allowing you to dive deep into its more intricate layers or just sit back and watch our busy little peeps square around zealously playing their part in the society of your own making. What cannot be understated and goes way beyond the gameplay value is the significance of industrialisation and pollution. Before We Leave is remarkably detailed despite its small relaxing exterior, not just in its gameplay design but in its clever foundation. It's hard not to notice the over philosophical and societal themes present Before We Leave, the most prominent being environmentalism and climate change. When you start the game with a quiet little community, you grow quickly out of minimalistic bliss and head first into a gaping maw of industrialisation. Reaching the point of industrialisation is a key milestone in Before We Leave. With it, you'll be able to produce and refine potent natural resources with material goods needed to advance your society and expand across the globe into the stars. The problem is, with a great abundance comes great responsibility. So guys, I'm going to leave today's review there. I would rate this game a 10 out of 10. This game is really relaxing and it's fun to play. It doesn't get boring at any point through it and I really enjoy it. As I said at the start of the video, we have now switched over to Scottish Gaming Rebels, so make sure you're checking us out over there. With that, bye. Industrial and manufacturing buildings will lead to two things. The first being pollution and the second being unhappiness. Pollution is something that's tough to manage and really challenges to think ahead in terms of placement, particularly if buildings like steel mills and oil refineries have to place them accordingly to avoid polluting the entire island. There are ways to tackle the pollution output from these buildings, but much of the most efficient ones are pretty far along in the research tree. Coming right after you've already colonised another planet, it sounds silly to master space travel before innovating new eco-friendly solutions for climate change, but when you think about it, it's surprisingly and depressingly accurate. Pollution is also a big factor in the happiness of your peeps. Be bummed out knowing that you're helping killing the planet too, right? Though you do have options to increase the happiness of your populace. The issue is that these struggle to lift anyone's spirits if not used and managed accordingly. Not even things like clothes or jewellery can cause a tidal wave of happiness. Who would have thought material possessions would be so ineffective at making people happy? Before We Leave is remarkably thought-provoking with a whole host of philosophical subtext and depth. It challenges you to think about your impact on the planet, both in-game and in the real world, whether that is conveyed through a gameplay design or the message it's trying to promote. It is so much more than what it shows on the surface, elevating its quality far beyond what you might expect. Looking beyond Before We Leave's addictive gameplay and central themes, it wouldn't be complete without one thing: its positively charming style and tone. Firstly, you have its graphics. Before We Leave's look gorgeous, without ever pushing for next-gen realism, understanding that more often than not, bigger doesn't equal better, and that simplicity is king. Every building and piece of land is expertly textured and pretty to look at, with each buildings and biome having its own distinct look and feel. On top of that, you have the option to enable adding graphical effects like light bloom, which is still constantly chasing the horizon. Second is its wonderfully merry soundtrack. From the moment I loaded up the game, I was moving my head and shaking my hips to its multitude of jolly jingles and rambunctious rhythms. It feels very much inspired by the sea shanties or bard songs, which are hopefully happy peeps will play non-stop through night and day. This is what leads the game to much of its pleasant and calming atmosphere, and something you want to hear for yourself.